Good afternoon. We will be starting at 3 p.m. Good afternoon. We will be starting in 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone. There's still quite a few people joining, so I'll just give it another 30 seconds before we start. Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first day of the CLA's Rural Powerhouse Week. This is a week-long programme of digital events designed to explore, to get to the details of important issues that are affecting the rural economy and your business, wherever you are in the country. Today's theme is about the transition to new agricultural policy and preparing your business for a future without the basic payment scheme. This is very timely, given that the Royal Assent for the Agriculture Bill earlier this month, and now just over a month before farms in England start the transition. You may have heard the CLA President, Mark Bridgman, this morning in conversation with DEFRA Secretary of State. George Eustace emphasised the importance of farming being profitable, but also that it has to be done in a way that supports nature and climate. If you missed it, it will be available online. This afternoon, we have a hugely experienced panel of speakers to offer insights into how you can prepare for the future with BPS. Kim, I think that, could you move the slides forward, please? Thank you. The panel this afternoon is going to look at a future without BPS and offer their insights into how they can integrate farming and the environment. I will let the speakers introduce themselves, and we will also go through, as we go through the programme. Each speaker has a short presentation, and then we will have a panel discussion followed by a question and answer session from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, either to a specific speaker or to the panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat function, as they will not be noted by the panel. Just to note, today's session is being recorded and will be available on the CLA website in due course. And for those of you who are tweeting, please use the hashtag RPW2020. Right, now to get things started, I'm going to take a few minutes to set the scene with a policy update. This has a focus on England, but our next speaker, Manon, will update on policy development in Wales. You could go to the next screen, next slide, please. So as you are hopefully aware, the first new primary legislation in agriculture since 1947 got royal assent on the 11th of November. It was first introduced into Parliament in September 2018 and has had a fairly tortuous journey due to the politics of Brexit and latterly due to COVID, but we have got it over the line now. Next slide, please. The Act itself has 8 parts, 58 sections, 7 schedules and 102 pages. But for those of you who haven't looked at it in detail, I've summarised it here in one slide. It is essentially an enabling act providing powers to the government to develop policy. The policy bit comes later. There are 3 main areas covering provisions for financial assistance, and importantly, this is the major shift towards the payment for public goods, but there's also provision for productivity growth. There's also a section on transition, so powers to change the current cap legislation, but also removal of direct payments from 2021 in England. But there's lots of other parts of it around markets and supply chain that will help to support the sector. Wales is covered in the Agriculture Act. It has a separate schedule, but this is only temporary until Wales brings forward their own agriculture bill next year. Next slide, please. The new policy has been in development alongside the agriculture bill. DEFRA summarised the current status of policy in their February statement in 2020, and we are expecting their next statement, the Agricultural Transition Plan, anytime soon. This new document will have information on all continuing and new schemes and the timelines. In particular, we are expecting it to include details of cuts in direct payments beyond year 1. So to give you a bit of an insight into the headlines, for England, there are probably 5 main sections of policy that will be changing. Firstly, the direct payments, and with cuts starting in 2021. There'll be continuing agri-environment schemes, so the countryside stewardship will continue until 2024 under simplified options. The new flagship payment for public goods scheme, the environmental land management scheme, will start from 2024, but there will be pilots running up until that point. There are also schemes for productivity and resilience, so new productivity grant schemes starting in 2021, as well as research programmes and a business resilient fund. And then finally, there's animal policies to tackle animal and plant health, with animal welfare grants starting from 2021 and tree health and animal health programmes from 2024, with some pilots in the early years. Next slide, please. So just quickly looking at the direct payments. We know what the cuts in the first year are going to be made on a progressive basis, between 5 and 24%, depending on how much your current receipts are. But we've got no information on the remaining years, although we expect that to be in the Agricultural Transition Plan. The key message is that we understand that there's potentially a 50% cut in the BPS budget by 2024. And certainly by 2028, there will be no further direct payments. One of the things that we've highlighted is the valley of death to business, where direct payments have been cut before you can access an environmental land management scheme in 2022. And the new sustainable farming incentive is going to be introduced in the early part of transition to help bridge that gap. Next slide, please. So the environmental land management scheme, we're currently in a process of ELM test and trials, and we'll shortly be starting the ELM pilots from next year, towards the end of next year. Full ELMs will only be available to everyone from 2024. And in the meantime, we have the countryside stewardship, which, as I said, is being simplified, and the sustainable farming incentive, which will be introduced from 2022 and run through into ELMs once from 2024. Next slide, please. So it's important to say, just this is a busy slide, but just quickly, the Agriculture Act is not the only thing that's shaping the future. There's also the Environment Act and the Climate Change Act, and any number of strategies and policies that have been done in the last few months, and a lot more coming in the next few years. Next button, please. And of course, we've got the Brexit transition at the end of this year and what that will do for trade agreements. And finally, the impacts of COVID-19 on the economy and future budgets that we need to contend with. So the good news is that we have got a panel this afternoon who are going to give their insights into all these changes and how farming needs to change in the next few months. So I'm now going to hand over to Manon Williams, who's a partner and solicitor at Agri Advisors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, pnawn da, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Manon Williams and I'm a partner and solicitor at Agri Advisor, a legal firm specialising in agricultural law and rural matters. We've heard from Susan what the current position is in England, so now let's turn to look at where we are with future agricultural funding in Wales and what we know so far. There are significant differences between the proposals and also the stage of transition between England and Wales. The latest Welsh Government consultation was issued in July, and that consultation closed about a month ago now. The aim of the consultation was to look at an interim framework to bridge the gap between 2021 and 2024 and proposed ways of simplifying current CAP regulations until the Welsh Government's plans for the future of agriculture and the rural economy are delivered through a white paper, initially expected in December, but more likely to be in early spring, and the introduction of an Agriculture Wales Bill in the next Senedd term in 2021. As Susan said, the UK Agriculture Act received royal assent some 10 days ago, but I think we're some way off seeing the Welsh equivalent yet. In terms of BPS, the Welsh Government's confirmed that this will remain the same for 2021, subject to replacement funding being provided by the UK Government. And then the most recent consultation, which the Welsh Government has responded to last week, will shape payments for 2022 and 2023, with the new schemes as proposed and discussed in Sustainable Farming in Our Land coming into force in 2024. In terms of what's to come in 2022 and 2023, BPS will remain largely the same, but the Welsh Government are looking to try to simplify things and reduce the administrative burden on farming businesses. Of the 11 key areas where the Welsh Government proposed changes, 8 will be adopted, which will include things like changing the rules on cross-border applications, removing the crop diversification element of the greening payment, and changing the system in terms of when the BPS is paid to Welsh farmers. Also contained within the consultation was the Welsh Government's proposals about its own domestic rural development plan, and this aspect was somewhat more controversial due to the proposal to prioritise environmental objectives over the rural economy and rural communities. These proposals will be taken forward, but with amendments to reflect the views of respondents. The proposals received a fairly mixed response, and some have questioned the purpose and value of changing the scheme for 2022 and 2023, and whether these additional changes are necessary at all. The legislation for BPS is supposed to be in place before the end of the year in readiness for claim year 2021, and the legislation governing rural development in Wales will come into force in early 2021. Looking beyond 2023, the Welsh Government have confirmed that no final decisions have yet been taken on the nature of any new scheme, but it's clear from previous consultations that there'll be a big shift in what farmers need to do to qualify for direct payments. A big emphasis is being put on 2 key pieces of legislation which only apply in Wales, being the Environment Wales Act and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Payments will be available for actions that deliver economic, environmental and social outcomes which benefit the public, so things such as clean air and water, carbon capture and improving biodiversity, for example. There'll also be a business support element to the Sustainable Land Management payment and opportunities for capital investment. We haven't yet had any detail as to payment rates or methodology, but there's been a proposal to use farm sustainability reviews as a way to initially access the payment. Payments are likely to be capped for larger farms, and collaboration will be encouraged and incentivised where this could lead to catchment or landscape change or habitat creation. In terms of funding, the Welsh Government have been putting pressure on the UK Treasury to ensure that Wales receives full replacement funding post-Brexit. This is one of the promises made in the Conservative Party's manifesto. However, given the current economy and the level of borrowing as a result of COVID-19, I think this is an area of concern. And in fairness to the Welsh Government, it's very difficult to try to finalise details of the post-BPS schemes without knowing what level of funding will be available to us. We've heard plenty of talk about a transition period and ensuring that Welsh businesses have enough time to make adjustments to their business model, which is vital. However, as an agricultural advisor, one thing which I think is really important is that we get the full detail of the proposed new scheme and legislative basis in sufficient time. Some of you will have heard me previously use the example of the 2015 CAP reform, whereby there was very little time between the guidance being released and actual implementation of the basic payment scheme. And this led to a huge amount of problems and a lot of litigation. It's vital that as much information as possible is made available at the earliest opportunity, so that businesses can be fully prepared and have sufficient time to make any necessary changes to qualify for the new scheme. In terms of our work as agricultural solicitors and how we've been preparing farming businesses for life without BPS, we've been discussing this issue and encouraging farmers to play an active role in all consultations which shape their future. We've been trying to make sure that farmers and rural businesses are ensuring that the things they do have control of are being done. So reviewing their businesses, ensuring there's an up-to-date business plan, reviewing succession plans, and so on. We in Wales are fortunate enough to have access to funding for various advisory services through Farming Connect. And this can include things like business plans, planning advice, and succession surgeries. And we're encouraging businesses to use these services to help strengthen their business whilst they're available. Whilst there's no equivalent funding available in England, there's nothing stopping you approaching your team of advisors to get these plans in place. It's about dotting the I's and crossing the T's to put the business in the best possible position to face the current uncertainty and trying to build a business which will be resilient enough to ride the wave of change. And I know my fellow panellists will be talking about risks, opportunities, and success factors. Farmers need to be realistic about what a future without or with a different level of support means for their business, and need to take proactive steps to ensure that their business can succeed in those circumstances. To conclude, my take-home message for any farmer listening is to prepare as best they can for these changes. It's been a strange year to say the least, and the agricultural industry is facing a challenging couple of years, not only because of Brexit and COVID-19, but also due to other threats such as climate change, growth in veganism, and potential changes in tax laws and the advantages currently available to farms and businesses. Change needs to be viewed in the positive, and where there is change, there's opportunity. You need to ensure that your business is geared up to face whatever change is thrown at it, and now is the time to look at how to make that happen, not when it's too late. On that note, I'll hand you over to Ed Hutley. Thank you very much for listening. Diolch.
And good afternoon, everybody. Rather ominously, I have elected for the title of Before We Fall Through the Trapdoor. But before we get going, shall we start with a quick poll question? How many of those of you joining us today believe that your business is profitable without the basic payment scheme? Now, while we wait for the result to come through, I'm going to discuss a little bit about what businesses can do to prepare themselves for the impending loss of BPS and what specific areas we are focusing on at Strutt & Parker to manage this issue. This graph here shows average return to farms of all types using data from the Farm Business Survey. The graph focuses on 4 key areas: income from farming, income from diversification, income from basic payments, and income from agri-environment schemes. And what's clear from looking at this graph is that despite these increases, the loss of BPS simply cannot be ignored, and returns by 2024 will be well below current levels, leaving a significant funding gap. I've now got the results back in for the poll, and over 53% of you responded with no, so 114 of you answered the poll saying no, and just 29% said yes, but there was 18% of respondents who were unsure. So thank you for answering that. I think what's clear from looking at this graph is that much hope is going to fall on things such as agri-environment schemes and the introduction of ELMS. We recently conducted a survey on attitudes with the CLA in regards to the loss of BPS, and 80% of the respondents stated that they felt that payments were unlikely to be sufficient. So worrying, given that we're placing quite a lot of faith in that. So how will we go about filling that gap? Well, I make no apologies for its inclusion in this presentation, but I'm afraid benchmarking is likely to fall part of this. The truth is that farms and estates must gain a better understanding of their financial performance and be able to identify where their businesses can be improved. Data can be easily reviewed and can provide immediate savings. We've worked very hard with our clients on the concept of the aggregation of marginal gains, the changing of 100 things by 1%, not one thing by 100%. So if the average English farmer changed their output by 1% and removed 1% from their overheads, the marginal gain in uplift in profit would be approximately 9%. And we've been involved with a significant amount of benchmarking, working with the AHDB. We've benchmarked over 400 farms, and the results show from that 10% of producers, the top 10% of producers have a whole farm net margin of £676 a hectare. And when that's compared to the group average of £288 per hectare, this shows how businesses can refine their performance to bridge the gap. Benchmarking should be completed annually. There will always be seasonal variabilities, but ultimately the thread will remain the same. And to get the best results, businesses should set targets for themselves to gain improvements each year. But where performance of crops is below average, a clear assessment of whether income would be better derived from other sources should also be considered. So if, just go back a slide, sorry. If we take the field circled in red, this has been circled as it's showing poor yield due to inherent waterlogging and is a relatively small field for modern machinery. So what options might we have at our disposal? Well, countryside stewardship has a number of options that present viable and consistent alternatives to commercial cropping. They provide greater returns and will help reduce the funding gap that I've talked about. In this instance, we may wish to consider whether a rotational option like AB15, a 2-year sown legume fallow mix, which produces a gross margin of around £450 a hectare after seed costs, may be preferable to a 2.5 tonne a hectare crop of oilseed rape, with a gross margin of around £350 a hectare. And the same logic can be applied to parcel-based options such as margins and grass strips to encourage commercial crops only being grown on the best bits of land. As consultants, we're often being challenged on what we can do to help businesses prepare themselves. Ultimately, there's going to be a significant amount of help is going to come through ELMS, and 80% of our survey respondents said that they were likely or very likely to consider applying for ELMS when it opens. However, it is now apparent that tier 1 of ELMS will not be hugely dissimilar to what we've seen from CSS, and this is causing some concern. 46% of respondents felt that ELMS might not deliver the environmental benefits that we wanted as a consequence of this close alignment. Tests and trials are progressing with updates being published on regular intervals, and it's providing an indication of what we might expect. But details in regards to monies is not overly clear, and it's unlikely that it's going to bridge the gap entirely. So there's going to be a need for alternative income streams. Many businesses have already diversified their offerings and derive income from more than a single source. Holiday lets, office space, farm shops and residential development, to name but a few. And the objective for this should be to squeeze the most out of these existing resources. But to caveat that, that isn't just a case of increasing the rent. It should be about sustainable expansion. The small grant scheme, LEADER and RDP growth program have allowed businesses to invest in innovation. These will drive efficiencies and enable businesses to develop or establish themselves. We know from Susan telling us earlier that these are likely to continue as part of the future agricultural policy. An emerging area of interest in the market for helping the government's drive to avoid and reduce carbon, an emerging area of interest is the market for helping the government drive its reduction on carbon emissions. As an industry, we have the opportunity to recover through offsetting too, but this won't be simply just planting trees. It will require a deep understanding of natural resources. We are starting to build up a database of farms that we're completing carbon audits and natural capital assessments for. Once completed, these can be used to tender for delivering biodiversity net gain, which is offsetting large infrastructure projects, and the trading of carbon credits. These will require some specialist advice, and if engaged with properly, could provide some interesting returns for businesses. I'd be delighted to discuss these further, but in the interest of time, I will draw things to a close. Hopefully this provides you with a bit of a holistic steer for a few areas to focus your attention on before we fall through the trap door in inverted commas. Next up, we've got Emma Watson, who farms in North Oxfordshire. Emma's going to talk about what she's doing with her own business to manage the loss of BPS. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Ed. I'm Emma Watson, farm management consultant at Gas & Associates for over 20 years and farming 900 acres in North Oxfordshire, which is mainly arable, but with a suckler herd as well. Subsidies have been an effective way of de-risking agricultural production over the last 70 years. If crops fail or prices are low, then farmers still have some level of guaranteed income to cover the costs incurred. This has encouraged the high input, high output production systems that we see across much of the UK and Northern Europe. Businesses have been prepared to take the gamble of investing significant quantities of working capital into the growing of crops, whether it be in fertiliser, pesticides or machinery, as even when yields are poor, usually due to the weather, they can use the subsidy to offset the costs incurred. So for agricultural businesses looking at a future without this safety net, and with weather patterns becoming more extreme and crop failures more likely, how do we de-risk our agricultural businesses for ourselves? Other income streams and diversification are a great way to spread risk, and are something Ed has already touched upon. However, I want to focus more on the coalface of agricultural production, as not everyone has the location, resources, and opportunity to diversify. First place to start is knowing your business. The greatest benefit of benchmarking is that it makes a business engage with its financial performance. It's an old cliche, but it's true. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. None of the examples that follow are possible if you do not have good data, and it needs to be accurate, not fudged. I need to keep this brief, so I'm just going to touch on a few areas as examples of looking at risk management across a business, using my own farm as an example. Taking an arable farm growing combinable crops, ask yourself the question, which elements of your rotation make money and which don't? Which crops produce a good net margin and which don't? Which perform consistently, so are less risky, and which are more variable? These are the net margin figures from my own farm business, averaged over the last 3 years. Just to be clear, as well as variable costs, they include the establishment, application, and harvesting costs for each crop. We have a simple rotation, 50% first wheat, 50% break crop, split between oilseed rape and spring linseed. That gives us a rotational net margin of £543 a hectare. Clearly, the most profitable crop is a first wheat, but by definition, I need a break crop to allow the first wheat to be grown. So, do we continue growing unprofitable break crops that can be very inconsistent? For example, the linseed net margin ranged from a loss of £86 a hectare to a profit of £413 a hectare within the 3-year period. Or can we use in-field rotational stewardship options to boost our rotational margin? We are all used to the concept of using options to take out unproductive land, but what about to take out unproductive break crops? As you know, there are many stewardship options available, and I've highlighted just a few here. I've used net margin figures for the options, not headline payment rates. Seed, establishment, and management costs must be taken into account. Whilst there might be a delay in getting paid, stewardship money is guaranteed, and as long as you meet the requirements, there is no risk. So for example, on heavy ground, it might be more profitable to grow 2 years of a legume fallow and follow it with 2 wheats. Could you add a winter cover crop option to boost your spring crop margin and possibly reduce inputs? On livestock farms, can we add winter cover crops before growing maize? Use herbal lays as part of the rotation rather than grass lays. You can even stack options. For example, planting a winter cover crop and following it with a cultivated area for arable plants. A net margin of £552 per hectare and a fantastic entry for the following first wheat. This last example is what we've done on my farm. We've replaced the linseed in the rotation with a winter cover crop SW6, followed by cultivated area for arable plants, AB11. This has increased the rotational net margin to £647 a hectare, an extra £24,000 a year income for our farm, and it's eliminated risk on 25% of my arable area. You could make a case for saying I should have also taken out the oilseed rape area as well. But with changes we've made, I'm confident we've turned a corner on that one, but that's the story for another day. Making changes like this is a win for everyone. Improved profitability and less risk for the farmer, carbon capture, improved water quality, and habitat creation for the taxpayer, who is ultimately paying. It's important to point out, if you're replacing arable crops with stewardship options, you have to look at reducing fixed costs accordingly, which can be a big exercise on its own. Overall, this change in our rotation has had a number of positive benefits. We don't need to change our combine, she's under much less pressure. We no longer need to move grain at harvest when we're quite busy enough and can take advantage of higher prices for storing grain. And we can reduce the amount of labour employed. To be honest, in a nutshell, it's made farming easier. A second example to look at is how we grow our crops. What production system do we use? Every farm is different, but look at these two sets of net margin figures. The first from my farm and the second from a client. At home, we are following regenerative agriculture principles, using direct drilling, cover crops, companions, and other techniques to achieve sustainability, both in terms of profitability and the environment. The second farm is a more traditional cultivation establishment system, using artificial inputs to maximise yield. They are close geographically and on similar soil types. Do you want to invest £615 per hectare in your wheat crop or 908? Does your land consistently produce a high enough yield to justify the higher investment? Would you accept a lower average yield, but with a much lower investment, maintaining or even increasing profitability and reducing your financial exposure to factors such as the weather? We have all been told that yield is king, but I believe profitability is the queen, and she's the boss. Just ask Prince Charles. Every farming business will have different answers to the questions I've asked, depending on their soil type, enterprises, yield potential, business objectives, etc. There isn't one solution, but it is vital that we all start asking these questions now, as a farm can be a bit of an oil tanker that takes some time to turn. And I have a horrible feeling that the government is not going to give us much time to adjust. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Ian Gould.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ian Gould. I'm Director of Oakbank Game and Conservation. Some of you may be aware of the company. We do a lot of work with countryside stewardship schemes, cover crops, etc., based in Cambridgeshire, working all over the country. What I've wanted to talk to you today is, if you are going to use stewardship or in future ELMs, what are the critical success factors for doing this? Because it is a deal at the end of the day. You're being asked to produce something or not to do something, and how to do this well. And what I'd suggest, it's certainly been proven but lots of times, that getting good advice at the start will pay dividends for you in terms of having an agreement that you understand, that you're happy with, works for your farm, but moreover, it works better and delivers more for the environment, which is ultimately what it's there to do. You do need to walk your farm thoroughly and find out what you've already got there. We would suggest the key is to retain, improve, and if possible, connect these features. Connectivity of environmental features is really key to them delivering well across a landscape. Note where you already have any red list species, things like grey partridge, barn owls, hares, etc. And then look at other things to deliver what's being sort of encompassed in the word natural capital, and use the opportunity and finance that stewardship provides to build that for the future, understand it better, and get to understand the potential for these new markets that are coming down the line. You need to understand what a suitable option is for a given location, because there isn't much flexibility once you've signed up. And it's very important you understand that the payment rate is not a guide to how suitable an option is for a particular site. And as I say, the best schemes are not created on a spreadsheet. You do need to get out on the land. Assessing them on a spreadsheet in terms of what they're going to cost to do and what they're going to deliver is very important, but don't design them there. Design them out on the farm with a good advisor. This is an example of one we've put together, And it's really here just really to show you, that the sort of the buff yellow colour shows just how much of the farm is left being farmed, as it is today. We're not taking out huge areas of land, but you will see how connected all the different options are, how we're buffering water courses, protecting water, soil erosion, etc. But although it looks quite complicated, in actual fact, the number of different things people have been asked to do here is that there's about 4 different types of options. So it's not overly sort of difficult to understand and actually achieve on the ground. So how do you deliver a great outcome? Well, I always assume that we want to do it right and do it once. It's the cheapest way to go. Things get expensive, you have to redo them or correct things that have gone wrong. Be prepared in good time, understand the rules and get some good guidance. And very importantly, and this is something which sometimes gets overlooked on larger estates, is let the team who are actually going to be doing the work understand what you're asking to do. Get them the training if that's needed, get them to see what the rules are and get them prepared early. But then when you are going to take some action, only do it when the conditions are right. I completely understand that there are dates and rules and sometimes they need to be there just to make sure things do get done in a timely fashion. But it's really important, just like you would with any other crop, that you do things when the conditions are right. And it doesn't get done because it happens to be convenient because the weather's not good enough to do something more important to you. Seedbed and weed control are just as vital for these crops as they are for any of your wheats or rape or anything else that you might be growing. So spend a little bit of time, understand what you're being asked to do, and do it right and do it once. These are some of the options that some people miss out on, and they pay very well and they deliver huge environmental benefits. The AB16 autumn sown bumblebird is, as the name suggests, sown in the autumn, which on heavy land is often easier. Lasts for about 18 months in the ground and does a really nice job. And cover crops, people are looking very carefully at their soil health at the moment, but there are really good options within stewardship that don't have any unnecessary rules in there. They really are quite helpful, quite flexible, and the payments are very attractive. So if you're looking at those, you don't need to wait for elms. These options are available to you now. Emma talked very well about the options of using stewardship as a break crop instead of a traditional one. And it can work very well, but make sure it does fit into your wider rotation. Importantly, as I said earlier, there isn't much flexibility, so understand all of the rules that apply to the choice that you're making. And one that sometimes goes wrong for people is the difference between the sown legume fallow and the herb-rich sward. So that's AB15 and GS4. The payment rates are different, and the AB15 pays more because you are not allowed to graze it or cut it for forage. You have to return all the cuttings to the ground, whereas GS4 you are. And we've got good examples of where people are making good money from the livestock that are able to graze the GS4, which takes the return over and above what can be gained from AB15. But it may be that AB15 fits in better on an arable farm with little or no access to livestock. Check the key dates, make sure they fit in with your plans and your planned rotation. And as I said earlier, the payment rate often gives a clue to the effort involved. So the higher paying ones often take more involvement and more expenditure, and as Emma referred to, more risk. So to get the crucial success that you're after, get good advice at the start and throughout. Involve your agronomist in some of these decisions. It may be that they are the person that you want to put this together, but often that isn't the case, and another person would be more suitable, perhaps with a higher level of environmental knowledge on a particularly interesting site. But the agronomist role is very important for this. Don't underestimate that. Be honest about the profit potential of fields or areas of fields so you can site these things well. Identify existing habitats. Use these options to retain, improve, extend, and connect them. And don't forget to enjoy the fruits of your labour. When you see things like these chalk hill blues, it really does make you realise what this is all about, and it brings a smile to your face. And on a wet winter's day, when you reflect back through your photos and on your phone, which is often what I use to record all this information. So thank you very much. I'd like to hand back to Susan now to start the Q&A.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you to Emma, Ed and Manon as well. I would like to invite the panel to come back onto screen. So if you put your video on and unmute, we'll now move to a panel discussion and the question and answer session. I think we'll start with a few questions for the panel, but if you have questions that you want to pose, please use the Q&A button down at the bottom and I'll pick those up in a few minutes. Just to kick off this panel session, I'd like to ask Ed first about the profit of agri-environment schemes. You indicated that it would increase by 200% when ELM is introduced, but what that was for an average farm. And this is maybe picking up some of the comments in the questions already from Anna Halpenland and Anne Wilcox. They were asking about how can it work for different sized farms and for upland farms. So how might the ELM's income vary for different businesses?
Okay, so I mean, I think it's fair to say that specifics regarding payments at the moment remain rather vague. The graph that I showed in my presentation is a prediction based on modelling produced by our research team. We actually looked at 3 different scenarios: a pessimistic, optimistic and standard scenario, and that's taken from our standard scenario. I think in regards to sort of the commentary on the payments, it's likely that tier 1 is going to have the widest appeal, but it's not going to be overly regal for its recipients at the most basic level. Tiers 2 and 3 are likely to come with more financially exciting figures, but with that's going to come greater responsibility. And I think Ian sort of hit the nail on the head really, which is that you know, a lot of these schemes are intended you know, to provide environmental gain and not just money in the back pocket. But you know, I can envisage a role for farms and estates of all sizes and locations within the ELMS programme. The trials programme has been specifically introduced to help with this and to ensure that we get a you know, well-worked scheme from that. You know, potentially there's greater hope for uplands and livestock farmers, as you know, a lot of research is going to be targeted in their direction. But ultimately, you know, funding is going to be available for all levels of engagement and for all offerings. So, you know, our challenge is to be open in our approach to these. You know, whether it's providing you know, biodiversity gain or delivering on a public good such as green space.
Thanks, Ed. You also mentioned that the value of business analysis and benchmarking, and I'm sure nobody on this webinar will disagree, in theory at least. In practice, you know, it's not that widespread. There's less than 25% of businesses do enterprise level benchmarking. That's based on some HDB stats or DEFRA stats from a couple of years ago. How can you encourage the reluctant benchmarker? Ed, if you want to just answer that one quickly, and then I'll ask Manon as well about how that goes in Wales.
I mean, unfortunately, there's a bit of a stigma associated with benchmarking. You know, often there's concerns about whether or not the figures provided are accurate. And you know, I think that ultimately the onus and responsibility is going to be on farms and estates to make sure that the data provided is as accurate as possible. I mean, ultimately, people are only kidding themselves by not submitting accurate data. And you know, that will only breed further confidence. I think also there's a bit of an misunderstanding about what benchmarking can constitute. It isn't just measuring data between different farms. It can be measuring data on your own farm. You know, for those of you that aren't convinced, you know, I would say this to you. You know, the most expensive words in the next few years will be, "We've always done it this way." And we've therefore got to challenge ourselves on this point more than ever to look at what we're doing to justify whether or not it's the right thing to be doing.
Thanks, Ed. And Manon, how are things done in Wales?
Yeah, so benchmarking is an issue here in Wales as well, and we've seen previous incentives such as the red meat benchmarking scheme where businesses could receive £1,000 per business for providing the data, and of course the results of the benchmark itself having a less than expected uptake. I'm not really sure why farmers are reluctant to benchmark. Farmers generally are quite private people, so I suppose maybe it's a privacy issue, and perhaps, as Ed sort of mentioned, it's a reluctance to be compared to other businesses when the current model has worked, you know, just fine for possibly generations before, isn't it? Going forward, there have been some rumours in terms of new schemes post-2024 in Wales that we might have a tiered element where farmers would be paid a basic level for things like being farm assured, having a business plan and so on. but with a higher rate then being available if the business is willing to do more. And one of the things that's been suggested in the sort of do more category is submitting benchmarking data. From my own experience, benchmarking is certainly something which is beneficial to our farming business. So I really hope that Welsh farmers take up the opportunity, especially in light of the current changes, because as I mentioned in my talk, now is the time to sort of prepare yourself for what's to come.
Thanks, Manon. Just continuing on that theme, really, Emma and Ian, I'd be quite interested in your views around the figures that Ed put up as well. The agri-environment profit, that was a profit figure, not the top line. It's not the income from countryside stewardship. It was the profit figure. In your experience, are many businesses looking at their costs and income, their income and their cost of delivery environmental as a separate enterprise, or is it less clear?
I think perhaps historically people haven't. I can think of one or two clients where income from ELS and HLS agreements is used to help offset shoot costs, despite the farm paying for all the inputs. I do, though, think it's important to identify stewardship agreement as its own enterprise. It needs to deliver an output in terms of environmental benefit for which it receives an income, and it's then costs associated with this delivery. And some of them can be significant. And we need to be able to see that it's performing as envisaged and that it remains better than alternative options. So at home, our crop recording is now set up that we have SW6 and AB11 combo as a crop, and all the income and costs are attributed to it. So it produces a net margin that we can then compare to the other crops in the rotation.
I would just add to that, Susan, that we've got examples of estates where actually the farming has been consolidated into sort of sensible rectangular blocks within the field. And then all of the peripheral area around those rectangular blocks has been put into stewardship. And each part has a separate profit and loss account. In fact, each part's done by two separate businesses. The farming is done by a farming contractor and the stewardship is done by the landowner. So that's a fairly extreme example of what can be done, but the stewardship scheme is absolutely profitable. There's no two ways about it. But the key to it is getting really good advice to find something that is really suitable for the site you're going to put it on. Because there's a danger that if you just look at the numbers, you actually practically set yourself up to fail. And if you set yourself up to fail, you've got 5 years of trying to get past that problem. And that can get very, very expensive. So, getting some good advice at the outset, making sure that what you're being asked to do is understood and achievable for you on the place that you've signed up to say you're going to do it. That's absolutely crucial if you're going to be successful. And all the benchmarking in the world won't help you if you've done that part badly.
Right, thank you. And just a follow up, really, Ian. You said that the best stewardship schemes aren't created on a spreadsheet, which is effectively what you're saying. How can farmers improve their environmental delivery without increasing their costs?
Making good decisions at the outset, but also, really giving it as much consideration as any other crop on the farm, so that timing of your doing a particular job can be the absolute difference between success and failure. And we know when the weather's good, we get much busier on the phones because people want to get seed and they want to put it in the following day. Now, you wouldn't think about your wheat crop literally the day before you were going to do it. You would give it some more thought and some more preparation. So getting it right first time is the cheapest way. It always is. If you do it once, then that's going to be the cheapest option. So a little bit of thought, a little bit more planning, a little bit more, reading up or phoning up your advisor to get some good advice beforehand. Doesn't really cost you anything apart from a few minutes of time, but it can make a huge difference to the outcome, which will deliver for both you and for the environment.
Great, thank you very much. Right, we've covered quite a lot of ground in those questions. I'm now going to, I'm looking at the questions that have been put into the question and answer box. So if you've got some questions burning, now is the time to put them in. I'm going to go first to Ian Piggott's question. He said the Secretary of State said to Mark Bridgman this morning that countryside stewardship and the sustainable farming incentive will be the stepping stone to tier 3 under ELMS. For those with schemes ending in 2021, would you be advising clients to enter into a new mid-tier countryside stewardship in 2022 or wait and see? Ed, I'll come to you first, and then if anybody else wants to come into that, please shout.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question, and I think the viewpoint that I've been sort of giving to my clients is that ultimately, we have an opportunity to join CSS agreements starting in 2022, which will enable us to receive some level of income. If when ELMS is rolled out nationally, it's found out that you're being sort of discriminated by not being in an ELMS scheme, you'll be able to leave your CSS scheme early. So ultimately, I see that as a major plus side in putting in an application for a CSS scheme rather than waiting to see how things unfold.
Thanks, Ed. Anybody else want to come in on that one?
One of the things that was spoken about this morning was the possibility of rolling start dates. So the problem, I'll give you an example. We have a client who their higher level stewardship scheme finishes in March. Now, they are being offered a 12-month extension, so it'll just roll on until March of the following year. But say they decided that to review the mid-tier or higher tier options, they would have to wait 9 months with no funding for all of their environmental work. And in their case, I think it's about £65,000 a year. So, you've got 3/4 of that money is missing for that period of time, which is a big disincentive to perhaps produce a much better agreement under the mid-tier stewardship options, which you're certainly looking at. By moving to the rolling start dates, which we very much encourage, it worked extremely well before, that sort of cliff edge would drop out, and you'd be able to make the decision based on really good factors like the environmental beneficial choices that you'd be making for the stewardship scheme.
Thanks, Ian. I'm now going to go to a question from Seb Murray. They ask, Emma mentioned shedding fixed costs in a regenerative agriculture system. How have you gone about doing that on your own farm, and how does it compare? Well, with clients as well. Are you a one-off if you've managed it, or is it applicable to others? I guess is the question.
It is, and I am very conscious that every farm business is different. My soil type is different to somebody else's soil type. All my clients, we all have different ways of establishing our crops, and there isn't one size fits all. But the fixed costs we've shared, we now operate a drill, a set of rolls, and a sprayer. That's just simple. So machinery repairs, and there's obviously one tractor that does all the work. So we're putting hours on the tractor, running costs are low. And even the drill, the direct drill we've got is actually a old Vardestat drill that's just had the system tests taken out. We were about to go and spend £70,000 on a brand new weaving GD drill, and suddenly realised that actually we've been doing it with our Vardestat for the last 5 years, and actually what was the point of spending that money? So I think we can really can sort of change our fixed cost structure. Obviously, there can be really difficult decisions as part of that in labour profile and that kind of thing. We had to go through an exercise of redundancy. We had a very open conversation with our farm staff in terms of, would people want to take full redundancy, or actually would people go part-time? And actually they ended up job sharing. They both wanted to stay in their cottages, and so they just used to work half days and job share that way. So you can be imaginative without just having to slash. You can be imaginative and bring people with you and be on board on that. But no, we are looking more and more on clients' farms as well, is actually how do we reduce these costs of production? We can't afford to have all this money tied up in crops, in producing our crops, unless you're going to hit your 10 tonne a hectare yield every time. But it's quite fun, and everywhere is different. That is the biggest thing. Just because it works on my farm doesn't mean it works everywhere.
No, that's a very good point. I think a similar question, but I think more directed into Wales. Manon, I wondered if you would answer Alice Grimes's question. It's a question about whether the Welsh Government budgets can offer enough support for upland livestock farmers in particular to enable them to compete with the UK and internationally and be economically viable enough to grow their business.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. So obviously we don't know what the budget's going to be. We're waiting for the UK government decision on that. So it's difficult to answer that sort of level of detail at this point. But upland livestock farmers are potentially at risk going forward. And based on comments made by George Eustace, sheep farmers, which the majority of upland livestock farmers in Wales are, seem to be the sacrificial lambs, excuse the pun, of Brexit. That said, Welsh upland is the perfect place for some of the public benefits, which Welsh Government have mentioned in previous consultations. So, provided Welsh governments are willing to make the changes needed to allow them entry into those schemes, there's no reason why they can't continue with their livestock farming, supported by the income from sustainable land management. And if those changes are put in place and those schemes are, taken advantage of, I don't see any reason why Welsh upland livestock farmers can't compete with the UK and internationally and be economically viable enough to grow their business. We've got some of the best produce in the world, and we need to have a bit of faith and a bit of confidence in what we as a country can produce and what we as farming businesses can offer. So I think definitely that the opportunity is there as long as we embrace it.
Thank you. Ian, I'm just going to come to you now with a question really about the technicalities of ELMS. I mean, what it's going to cover, because I think there's certain sectors of farming that haven't really always seen the opportunity in current countryside stewardship. So dairy farming and some of the upland options haven't always been particularly attractive. So there's a number of questions that are touched on this in this topic. So how can you make ELMS work in the uplands? What sort of options should there be in order to encourage participation and make sure that it helps those businesses to be viable?
I think it is more difficult because the productivity on those areas, on extensive land holdings and extensive farming are lower, and so to make those things more exciting and more interesting financially to farmers is more difficult because the productivity is that much lower. It's harder to sort of scale up those benefits, but there are wider things at play, social, environmental, and so on. So it really, I guess, comes down to the most important thing is what are those values that those areas produce in terms of natural capital and social capital? What are they really worth to us? And in a time when government budgets are going to be really stretched, I mean, we can't get away from that. That's just a fact of life, unfortunately. We really are going to be asked to justify money that's coming our direction. So the first thing I think we need to do is really understand what those benefits are worth. It's absolutely true that stewardship has been, the uptake in those areas has been very poor, and that's obviously because the deal wasn't good enough. The money being offered wasn't good enough for what they were being asked to do. But as I say, with budgets being stretched, we really do need to know the value, and that's got to be the starting point.
Thanks, Ian. Anyone else want to comment on that? Or I've got one more question. I've probably got time for one more question. I was going to look at the issue about planning. There's been a couple of questions about the productivity grants, and while it's great to have the grants available and to invest, to be able to get help in investing in your business, that often needs planning and for building changes, and that is often a bit of the problem. Ed, do you want to say anything about that and how that can be changed, or what needs to happen to make that easier?
No, I think it's a very valid point, really. Unfortunately, the process for applications at the moment is quite lengthy, and in regards to applying for the funding, and then you have to ensure that you're also able to progress through the various planning obligations, in regards to some projects, and there isn't any particular quick answer on it. You're dealing with large public bodies which generally aren't very well aligned, and I think ultimately that is one of the challenges that we face. But I think it's like all these things, it's communication is going to be the key in terms of making sure that guys that are putting in applications are sort of making sure that they're doing their utmost to allow an application to progress, because ultimately the funding is there. It's just making it happen. But no, there isn't a silver bullet on it, I'm afraid.
Other comments on that one?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say it's a similar experience here in Wales, really, and it's one of my biggest bugbears since I read that first consultation we had out in Wales, where Welsh Government were encouraging everyone to diversify, it doesn't seem as though things like the planning policy have been considered as part of that, and also in terms of other areas. So another example would be, for example, inheritance tax rules. So it's a huge bugbear, like I say, for the Welsh Government to encourage you to diversify on one hand, and then for that not to be aligned in terms of other policy we have. And as Ed said, we don't really have a silver bullet in terms of that, but I hope that that is something that, you know, our unions, CLA, etc., are lobbying for going forward.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm afraid we are just about running out of time now. There's a few questions that I haven't touched on. Some of them were really about resourcing of Natural England and Forestry Commission and others to help support the delivery, and I think that's probably something we probably won't be able to resolve today in any case. And there's a few other questions that we will respond to separately given that we haven't got to them. I expect this conversation today is just the start, and I think I would probably appeal to everyone to look at it as the start if you haven't already started thinking about some of these changes and how they're going to impact on your business. Quite a startling statistic that so many haven't, only 29% actually feel that they are profitable without direct payments. So it's obviously a real challenge for people over the next few years during this transition period and as the new policy settles in. So in the last minute, I would just like to thank all our panellists, Manon, Ed, Emma and Ian, for excellent presentations and their insights and answering the questions so well. I'd like specifically to thank Strutt and Parker, who are our headline partner for the week, and also to Oakbank for supporting today's event. I would also like to thank you all for your participation and encourage you to sign up to the other events that we've got this week. Tomorrow is about international trade, Wednesday is about climate change, and Thursday is about navigating the planning system. So for those of you who felt we didn't have time to explore the problems of the planning system this afternoon, I suggest you drop in on Thursday. The next event is tomorrow morning in conversation with Greg Hans. He's the Minister of State for Trade Policy, and that's at 1 o'clock tomorrow. So please register for that if you're interested. You will have received an email this morning packed with videos, podcasts, blogs, and all about the future without BPS. So please do take a look at those. This session will be recorded as well and will be available on the website later as well. Yeah, that just leaves me to say thank you very much, and I hope you will join us again soon. Thank you.